Good morning, everyone. As Nikki said, I'll be talking to you a bit today about net zero targets, electrification, and how we can use data to get better transitions. So firstly, a little bit about flexible power systems, as I imagine that some of you may be unfamiliar with our business. The central proposition is that the large quantities of data that commercial vehicle operations generate can be used to make better decisions in the journey to net zero. And by making better decisions, we can dramatically reduce the costs and risks involved in that transition. Firstly, the problem that we're facing, there's this kind of tension between the critical role that commercial vehicles play and that their emissions impact. There's many statistics that you could rely on to illustrate the role that commercial vehicles play, but I think that sort of the role in distributing domestic freight is particularly powerful, that more than 3/4 of goods are moved around by road, and so without commercial vehicles, that modern society couldn't exist. At the same time, the UK government has made legally binding net zero commitments, and about 25% of all domestic emissions come from road transport, and within that, about 1/3 of those emissions come from commercial vehicles. And so that we need to tackle those emissions if we're going to achieve national net zero targets. On the corporate side, that your Scope 1 emissions are driven by fuel use in your fleet, and Scope 3 comes from your supply chain and your third-party logistics providers, again, who are using commercial vehicles. And so we need to address them if we're to achieve net zero. So I wanted to start off with a question to sort of assess the urgency from your perspective of addressing net zero targets. So if we could have the question up, please. So I'm interested in when you think that fleet decarbonisation requires action. Well, we agree with you. So there's a series of things which are driving action and urgency in this space. So on the one hand, you have legislation that the government's currently trying to drive change in the sector through a series of new vehicle sales bans, which are coming in for different classes of vehicle from 7 years out. At the same time that there's a number of corporate commitments which are being made. So you have various groups like the EV100 guys who are committed by 2030 to electrify everything in their fleet below 7.5 tons. If you think about the retention times that you have for your vehicles, that some of these guys are into full rate transition already. You've then got individual corporate players who've made net zero targets. Most of the retailers are around about 2035, and so it's hoving into view for them. And then sort of people like Royal Mail out in 2040. But there's an undercurrent in the sector of things like sort of increased ESG reporting going on, which is meaning that listed companies are under more pressure than ever before to reduce carbon. And all of those targets, which are up there on that screen, have been brought forward in previous years. In terms of what we've got on the blocks that we need to decarbonise, we've got sort of 3 classes of asset, I suspect, in your fleets. First, you've got the LCVs. We're probably furthest along in this space. There's probably more OEM offers than there are in other segments. And we're nearest to having something which will meet most people's needs. But at the same time, that transition is kind of in its infancy, because less than 1% of the LCVs on the road are electric currently. And we're still at only about 5 to 6% of new vehicle sales. So there's important barriers to be overcome there. Next, you've got your transport refrigeration units. So anyone who has a temperature-controlled distribution operation will know that it's probably between 10 and 20% of your fuel use. Now that there's an interest already in electrifying that sector through deploying depot infrastructure or kind of hookups, that's mostly being driven at the moment by the end of the red diesel duty exemption. But actually that there's a carbon angle to that as well. And we need to address the in-transit emissions from transport refrigeration units, which is why people are beginning to consider things like EPTOs, axle generators, and even sort of battery electric transport refrigeration units. You've then got the kind of the elephant in the room, which is the HGV and the large rigids, and that's undoubtedly the most difficult bit to decarbonise. And the reason for that is because, in very simple terms, is that the truck in the picture probably requires about 10 times as much energy as the LCV because of its mass and the distances that it travels. And that's right at the limits or even beyond the limits of current sort of battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell technology. and that the business case is not there for those zero tailpipe solutions at the moment, though the situation is very dynamic and constantly changing. So I'd like to ask you another question about sort of what type of technologies that you guys are considering for your transition. So there's a number of options. People are looking at biofuels, hydrogen, electric, combinations of the above, or maybe sort of every single option. So we agree with you again in terms of the fact that it's going to be a combination of solutions. We think that there's alternatives in every single one of those segments. I think there's probably most debate about what technology solution will be in the large rigid and HGV segment. But we think actually that there's going to be a sort of role for electric vehicles even in the HGV segment. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So the chart on the left is really sort of thinking about biofuel supply availability. Biomethane is a popular choice for a number of operators. It's zero carbon, has minimal operational impact when compared to other technologies. And so it's a really good way of decarbonising your fleet and doing something today whilst the other technologies are immature. However, that we can't transition the entire fleet over to biomethane. And the reason for that is supply capacity. You can see that the blue bar is how much energy we need to displace the diesel consumption. The green bar, that's very tiny, is how much biomethane we produce in the UK today. And the yellow bar is the maximum supply potential, so that we can't do this on biofuels alone. Then there's a sort of discussion about sort of hydrogen or battery electric vehicles. Now, I think that hydrogen has some really important advantages in terms of improved range and faster refueling, which will be really important to some operators. But it is and will remain a kind of premium option. And the reason for that is that the vehicles cost more than battery electric vehicles and will do so for the foreseeable future. And also because of the well-to-wheel efficiency of the hydrogen energy chain compared to battery electric vehicles, that the fuel costs will be materially higher than battery electric vehicles. So if you don't have a duty cycle that demands it, then the battery electric vehicles will be a more cost-effective option for decarbonising your fleets. Often that there are questions about the infrastructure side, and that people are right to raise concerns about the infrastructure, but there's nuance to it. So that the UK is capable of generating enough electricity to support the HGV fleet. You can see that the purple bar, which is our current annual generation output, is substantially larger than the yellow bar, which would be the EV energy requirement of transitioning the entire HGV fleet. So it's not a problem of overall production capacity. The challenge is getting the electricity into the right place at the right time, which requires very substantial infrastructure investments, which are being made at the moment to support renewables rollout and the electrification of heat, but there's a way to go. So if you accept that there's a degree of electrification that you're going to need to do in all of these segments, and once you start to get into it, that you realize that there's a degree of complexity. And that's because the technology we're replacing, the internal combustion engine, is a fantastic piece of technology, which is extremely flexible, and actually that all of our networks were designed to work with it. EVs bring with them new constraints in terms of payload and range that need to be managed in your operation. They also bring with them an infrastructure challenge, which I imagine some of you will be familiar with. The other thing that that infrastructure does is it couples your building and vehicle energy demands for the first time and creates a situation where you need to make potentially trade-offs between the energy that you devote to your buildings and the energy that you devote to your transport operations. On top of all of this complexity, you've got a constantly evolving technology environment, and so you rightly have concerns about obsolescence. To add to the sort of seriousness of the situation, your transition program, depending on your fleet size, may be a sort of tens or even hundreds of millions of pounds investment. You're likely to need to live with the consequences for at least a decade, so it's critical that you get it right. And at the same time, we have those sort of ever-advancing targets, which are sort of creating more time pressure to do this. And so it's a difficult situation. We think, though, that there is a sort of ray of hope, that there's vast quantities of data that enable us to make good decisions about that transition. That many of you will have vehicle telematics, so you have a very good understanding of what your vehicles do all day. There is also something like that type of telemetry available for buildings and generation assets, so we have a clearer picture than ever before of energy use on our sites. You have operations data from systems like Microlise, yard management systems, which tells you both more detail about what you need from your vehicles, but also why they're doing what they're doing. You can leverage your network modeling activity conducted by your operations teams to build a picture of what the future needs to look like as well. So you can scale this transition for a future version of your network, not just last year. We've got the tech roadmaps, which are coming out from the OEMs, which are beginning to give us a picture of what will be released when, and the legislative picture at least is sort of characterized perhaps by the government specifying what it wants, even if it doesn't yet know quite how it's going to get it. And so we can put all those things together in order to sort of support decision making. At FPS, we do that in sort of two arenas. One is in the field of planning the transition. So we use all of those data sources to build quite rich simulations of your fleets now and in future. And you get a very granular picture of which vehicles can be transitioned, which depots are suitable for transition, which ones should be further down the line. You can also optimize within those simulations to identify the lowest cost and lowest risk pathways to decarbonizing your fleets. And it's a lot cheaper to run simulations than it is to buy large quantities of hardware and just try it. The other aspect to it is real-time management. And to some extent, it's similar to the sort of stuff that you guys do today. So there's telemetry that you already use for tracking vehicles and trying to improve uptime. This just needs to be extended into things like charging assets, so you can manage the uptime of them in a similar way. You also have a whole load of advanced scheduling features in most supply chains that you're managing sort of yard movements, you're managing vehicle routes. Again, that in the EV space, that vehicle task matching is really important in terms of managing those payload and range constraints, but also you want to schedule your charging to be able to charge at the lowest possible cost because it can have a dramatic impact on your operating costs. So I'd like to ask you a question about the extent to which that you're considering data at the moment in part of your EV transition. Do you think that data will be more important in this sort of new net zero world or less important? Again, we agree that you're a good audience. I'll tell you a little bit about some experiences we've had with some of our customers and how that we've used data with them. Sainsbury's have a 2035 net zero target. It's a little closer than it sounds because they keep their trailers for about a decade. So they need to achieve full rate transition on the TRU component in their fleet within the next 2 years. Working for Sainsbury's, that we consume quite a large quantity of Microlise data. We had about 180,000 journeys covering LCVs, HGVs, and transport refrigeration units. We combined that data with their operations planning team to sort of understand the impact of network changes on the journeys that vehicles would make, and then layered on top of that energy models for the vehicles. And that produced an incredibly granular picture of the individual economics and power demand of specific vehicles that could then be aggregated up into depots across the networks. And so what Sainsbury's have is a granular transition plan where that they're able to say, this parts of our operation should be transitioned immediately because there's a good business case, it's technically feasible. Some of this stuff is really difficult, and so we need to wait for the OEM offers to get better. And then also understanding the intermediate zone where that we can do this piece of net zero, provided that we can make this bit of technology work. And so it drives purpose into their trials program. The other thing that Sainsbury's got out of doing this work was a much more efficient deployment of capital, that right-sizing vehicles and infrastructure for the task rather than building in lots of contingency can dramatically reduce capital costs. And the savings for Sainsbury's at LCV sites ran to hundreds of thousands of pounds for LCV depots, up to millions of pounds for HGV sites. And so it was worth doing this project. The other area that we work is in real-time operations with Waitrose. We helped them out with their first electric store. The store was intended to be a test bed of technologies that they'd need to get to 100% electrification in their e-com fleet. Had a number of hardware innovations in it, some of which are on our stand just outside this hall, but I'll talk mostly about software today. So Waitrose run the entirety of their sort of EV operation using a platform called FPS Operate. That platform is highly interconnected, so it connects into EV chargers over OCPP, it connects into vehicle telematics systems, it connects into building energy metering systems, it connects into the VOR system, and it also connects into Microlise. Now, you might be wondering why bother to do all of that. But you get 3 benefits from having such an interconnected system. The first thing is that all of your data is in one place. And so undertaking sort of analytics tasks or understanding the health of the system is very straightforward and easy. The second thing you can do, if you have all of the data in one place, is you can conduct dynamic optimization. And so that this system matches vehicles with tasks and also schedules charging in real time in response to evolving operational conditions, changes in site load conditions, and the availability of vehicles and chargers. So it builds resilience as well as cost saving into the system. The third thing you can do, if you can see everything, is you can see when things break. And so you can then start a remote automated response immediately. You can then start a remote human response. And if that doesn't work, you can dispatch people to site so you can improve the uptime of the overall system. It started out with about 7 vehicles on it in a store in St. Catherine's Dock, and has gradually expanded to have about 80 vehicles on it over the last year. The platform's now being trialed by a number of other retailers and is being expanded into sort of different segments over the course of this year. So to kind of sum up, that decarbonisation is undoubtedly a large challenge, that there's a range of solutions out there, and the answer will probably be a mix of them, but electrification is likely to be a very important component of that. Electrification is complex, but there's opportunities to use data to kind of untangle that complexity and get more efficient and less risky transitions. Be really happy to take any questions now, or if you want to come and have a chat with us on the stand. Thank you very much for having me.
Brilliant. I'll actually get you to stay with me, Michael, for a bit, because I think we do have a couple of questions from the audience. Just a reminder to submit your questions using the app, and they pop up on my iPad. Very clever stuff, this. So, Michael, this is a question from the audience. Where do cost savings arise from using data in decarbonisation programmes?
So there's a couple of places where it arrives. Firstly, in terms of capital costs, that it's very possible to over-specify what you're doing in terms of electric vehicles, end up with larger battery packs than you need, which means you sacrifice payload as well as spending more money, and also over-specify infrastructure, which then costs you money in terms of more expensive chargers and bigger grid connections. By right-sizing those elements, you can dramatically reduce the costs of your transition. The other area that you can use data is for sort of optimization. And so it's about trying to sort of operate the vehicles at sort of maximum utilization rates whilst charging them at the lowest possible cost. And even though that electricity is sort of much cheaper than diesel, it's still a material cost. And so being able to save sort of 20 or 30% through smart charging is a really sort of worthwhile thing to do.
And what about when you're planning your costs? Because is it you're looking more at the sort of the full life cycle of the cost rather than your initial outlay?
Absolutely. So that in all these instances, you need to take account of the sort of total cost of ownership, and that the question is sort of like how wide that you make that. And that depends on the operator in terms of how that they want to look at it. But it's always the case with sort of these low carbon technologies that the upfront investment costs are higher, and ideally that the operating costs over their life are substantially lower. And so considering that can often make the sort of business case where it may be more difficult otherwise.
We've got another question here. Will data protection legislation limit my ability to transition to net zero?
But it is an interesting question. Potentially not. So it's actually a system that we deal with within our system, so sort of GDPR rules and things like that. So that the system that we're showing there that we operate with Waitrose, that actually that we don't store any personal data relating to the drivers, that we have a means of filtering it out of the system, so we can use kind of anonymized vehicle movements in order to sort of be able to sort of manage those kind of data protection issues. As I think that no one really wants a kind of big brother in one of these systems.
And what are the main barriers to decarbonising fleets?
Well, I think there's the obvious one, which is cost, which I think will immediately sort of spring up. But sort of, within that, we need to sort of minimize that differential as much as we possibly can. But then I think that the other part of it is the complexity, that the electrification programs that we get involved in really are kind of multifunctional. So whereas before that you might have had a fleet manager who just decided, I'm going to buy some vehicles, I'll just fill them up with diesel. I maybe manage the diesel purchasing contract as well. Actually, in the organisations we work with, we see it as being an issue that sort of touches on, yes, fleet managers, critically important to vehicle choice, but also into sort of maybe property, who are maybe deciding about sort of the chargers, the energy purchasing parts, and ESG and finance all need to come together in order to make those kind of EV transitions work as best they can.
I mean, it's such a huge undertaking, and obviously everyone's learning with their journeys over time, year on year. Hopefully it gets easier. What is your advice, I suppose, to kind of decarbonise? I guess it's to start as soon as possible, but how can you make it as seamless and as easy as possible?
Well, I think it's obvious that I'm going to say, given the talk, that use the data that's available to you from systems like Microlise and your sort of metering systems, so you know what the impact will be.
Yeah.
But also it's really important to work collaboratively within your organisations. That if there's a disconnect between sort of transport and property, you can end up with things like vehicles and infrastructure mismatched, or sort of the people not understanding how to include the sort of electricity the EV is going to use in their hedging strategies and things like that. So that trying to foster collaboration within your organisations is really important, as well as using the data.
Do you think infrastructure will drive demand for vehicles or vice versa?
Yeah, it's kind of a classic chicken and egg problem, isn't it? That I think for the commercial vehicle sector, it's sort of slightly different. I think a whole bunch of people have return to base operations, and so that there's an opportunity to get started, as it were. But I think certainly that when we look at the HGV piece, that it's kind of clear that infrastructure costs for many operators will be unsustainable in a sort of depot environment, and so people will want to rely on the public infrastructure to the extent that they can. In order to sort of get that infrastructure built, I think there needs to be kind of clear direction from government, that I don't think it's possible for sort of someone to unilaterally build HGV charging infrastructure for the entire country. And so that I think that we probably need some intervention to make that happen, which would be important to driving that switch.
And just finally, I guess it's back to sort of our earlier discussion point. Is there any support out there for smaller to medium-sized companies to help with this transition from diesel to electric?
There is some support which is available. I think that we'd undoubtedly say that it's kind of insufficient from the government. The government basically has a series of things called sort of plug-in vehicle grants, which are sort of modest proportion of the cost of the vehicles. There are also things like the workplace charging scheme, which can make a modest contribution to your charging infrastructure costs. But for small businesses, undoubtedly that the cost challenge is still there. Informationally, that there are a number of resources which are sort of publicly available, which can help if you're planning on transitioning a small fleet. Organisations like the Energy Savings Trust have some good information that you can rely on, and that sort of people who are active in the space, many sort of scrupulous sort of charge point vendors and things like that, can often provide sort of decent advice.
Brilliant. Is there any sort of like community where, like-minded businesses and business owners can share ideas and share their journey, I suppose, of what they've been through with those that might just be starting out?
I don't think that there's one which is sort of specifically devoted to that, but that there's a number of sort of useful initiatives that I think that sort of Create Carbon Zero, I think, is sort of a really important organisation where people can share sort of best practice. I think that the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership has an important role in terms of informing people. And I think that trade bodies like sort of Road Haulage Association and Logistics UK are sort of trying to help their members on planning that.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, Michael, thank you so much. Really, really interesting chat. And for anyone that was watching and wrote it down, he shared his phone number. So if you need answers, he is the man to call. Michael, thank you so much. Huge round of applause.